What's going on, everyone? My name is Emmanuel and welcome to my channel Freedom is Capital, where we talk all things wealth, power and progress. If you watched my last video, you saw me in Ghana and I was there on the eve of something historic. This week, on Wednesday, 25th of March 2026, the United Nations General Assembly made a decision that's been 400 years in the making. Ghana's President John Mahama stood before the UN General Assembly and formally tabled a resolution declaring that the transatlantic slave trade was the gravest crime against humanity, and it passed. 123 countries voted in favor. Only 3 voted against: the United States, Israel, and Argentina. The United Kingdom, by the way, abstained. For the first time in the history of the United Nations, a vote was taken on the floor of the General Assembly on this particular question, and the world said yes. See, I was in Ghana the day before it happened. Now I'm in Nigeria, and I want to explain why this isn't incidental. Why this resolution is not just Ghana's story, but Nigeria's story, and the story of the entire West African coast, and why, through the lens of freedom is capital, the economics of what was decided this week matters much more than most people realize. See, most people see this as history, and it is, but I also see this as economics, and I think that changes everything about how you should understand what just happened. Okay, so let me give you the facts, because the news, they're going to give you the headlines, right? But I want to give you the substance, what actually passed, what it does, and what it actually means. So the full title of the resolution is Declaration of the Trafficking of Enslaved Africans and Racialized Chattel Enslavement of Africans as the Gravest Crime Against Humanity. It was tabled by Ghana, and let me be clear about this. Ghana led on this, but President John Mahama and Foreign Minister Samuel Ablakwa, they drove this resolution for over a year. Ghana went to the African Union, to CARICOM, which represents the Caribbean nation. They went to Brazil, the country with the largest population of people of African descent outside of Africa, and they built a global coalition, and that coalition held. And also, the day is intentional. See, March 25th is the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. And as President Mahama said himself, the date connects memory with action. The resolution rested on 3 pillars: historical accuracy, legal defensibility, and continental and diaspora alignment. Ghana was meticulous. This wasn't some rushed motion. This was over a year in the making. And let me tell you what the resolution actually does, because that's where the economics of this particular situation begins. See, Ghana is also uniquely positioned to lead this, right? It was the country with the highest number of slave forts and castles. These were the physical sites where over 12 million enslaved Africans were held, where they were trafficked and they never came home. So the context isn't just symbolic. And again, I was standing in that country that held the doors of no return. And centuries later, representatives of that same country walked through the doors of the United Nations, and the world, for the first time, acknowledged what happened. Well, it formally condemns the transatlantic slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity. It calls on member states to engage in dialogue or reparatory justice, including formal apology, financial compensation, restitution, and guarantees that it is never repeated. And it also calls for the prompt return of looted cultural artifacts, artwork, monuments, documents, national archives, all being asked to return to the countries of origin without charge. See, that last point is an economics point. Looted cultural capital is capital. Its absence is a measurable loss. Again, like I mentioned before, I'm in Nigeria, and I need to explain why this matters in this story. See, Nigeria was the single largest source for enslaved Africans taken across the Atlantic. Estimates from the Transatlantic Slave Trade database suggest that around 3.5 million people were taken from the territory that is now called Nigeria. Roughly a quarter of the entire trade. Again, numbers vary, but that's just for context. So the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Edo, entire civilizations hollowed out over generations. Badagry, right here on the Lagos coastline, was one of the main departure ports. Ghana held the force, Nigeria supplied the numbers, and the entire West African coast paid the price. This resolution belongs to all of us, and that Pan-African dimension, Ghana leading, Nigeria being part of the story, the entire West Africa being part of the story, the African Union backing this, the Caribbeans standing alongside. That's exactly what this moment represents. The diaspora united, the continent speaking with one voice. Okay, now I need you to understand something, because this, again, is the economics channel. And the way this story is usually told is as a moral story, a historical story, a political story. And a lot of the time it just leaves out the most important dimension of all. See, the transatlantic slave trade was the largest forced transfer of human capital in the history of the world. Let me say that again. The transatlantic slave trade was the largest forced transfer of human capital in the history of the world. That sentence contains everything. Human capital, not just human beings, though the loss of those lives, those families, and those connections is beyond measure. But capital, people who had agency, skills, knowledge, land, relationships, community, economic networks, the ability to produce, to create, to build, all of it was stripped, extracted, and deployed for the benefit of others. This was not just a crime against humanity in the moral sense. It was the most aggressive and sustained act of wealth extraction in recorded history. And Freedom is Capital says this: when you strip a person of their freedom, you strip them of their capital. When you do that to an entire people, across generations, across countries, you don't just cause suffering, you engineer a wealth gap that compounds over time. 12 plus million enslaved Africans trafficked across the Atlantic. Again, the largest forced migration in human history. 400 plus years. That's the duration of the transatlantic slave trade, from the 15th to the 19th century. And the consequences didn't end when slavery ended. Ghana's own Ministry of Foreign Affairs acknowledged this in their official statement. The language they used was not the language of emotions. It was the language of economics as well. They spoke of the structural inequalities that underpin debt asymmetries, development gaps, climate vulnerability, and global financial governance. That's not the language of sentiment. That's the language of economics. That's the language of systems. And it's acknowledging something that black economists and historians have been saying for decades. The poverty of the global south and the wealth of the west are not unconnected. They are two sides of the same historical ledger. See, the slave trade was not just violence. It was the most sophisticated wealth extraction operation in human history. And its balance sheet is still open. Because what gets recognized globally doesn't just shape memory, it shapes leverage. Okay, so let me apply the Freedom is Capital framework directly to this situation, because this is exactly what this channel is for. The thesis of Freedom is Capital is this: that freedom and capital exist in a reciprocal relationship. Freedom enables capital to be deployed, and capital expands freedom. When you strip one, you diminish both. See, the transatlantic slave trade was the ultimate expression of that relationship in reverse. Millions of people with their own economic system, their own land, their own governance, their own culture, their own accumulated knowledge, had their freedoms taken first. And with their freedom went their capital, their land, their labor, their future. And the capital didn't just disappear. It was transferred to plantation owners, to shipping companies, to insurance houses in London, to banks that still exist to this day, to governments that used it to fund industrialization, to the foundations of the modern Western economy. See, the wealth of the West was not built in spite of slavery. It was built on it. The poverty of black communities in Britain, in America, in the Caribbean, across Africa was not an accident. It was a cost that was never paid back. This UN resolution this week did not just acknowledge suffering, it also acknowledged a structural economic reality that has shaped the modern world. Economics can be viewed as a study of incentives and consequences. When you create centuries of accumulated advantage for some and disadvantages for others, and then say at the end of it that we're all equal now, go and compete, you have not created equality. You have institutionalized inequality and called it a level playing field. This resolution is the world formally acknowledging for the first time at UN level that the playing field was never level. 123 countries put their name to that. That acknowledgement, that legal, institutional, global acknowledgement, is the precondition for any serious conversation about reparatory justice. And it has now happened. Now, the word reparation is a loaded one. People tend to hear it and immediately think of checks being written, or reverse discrimination, or something politically divisive. You know, all those nonsensical distractions. But let's strip it back to economics. Reparations is not charity. It's not a handout. It's actually a concept that's rooted in basic economic and legal principle. If wealth was extracted through illegitimate means, justice requires that it be returned or compensated for. See, we accept that principle everywhere else in law. If someone steals from you and is convicted, the court doesn't just punish them, it orders restitution, return of what was taken, or equivalent in compensation. The question reparations asks isn't about whether people should feel guilty. Personally, I don't care for any of that. The question is, what's the correct accounting of what was taken, and what does justice require? Ghana's framework following this resolution includes the African Union's Decade of Action on Reparations and African Heritage, running from 2026 to 2036, and the CARICOM 10-point plan for reparatory justice includes practical measures, debt cancellation for former colonies, public health investment, educational infrastructure. These are not emotional demands. These are structural corrections. The wealth gap between black and white communities in Britain, again, is not a cultural failing. It's a historical balance sheet that was never settled. And this week, 123 different nations at the UN formally acknowledged that the debt exists. This is not a fringe argument anymore. This is the position of the majority of the world. See, you might be watching this in London, you might be watching it in Birmingham, Manchester, Toronto, or New York. You might be thinking, what does a UN resolution have to do with my life? Everything. Because the structural inequality that this resolution seeks to address, the wealth gap, the development gap, the debt asymmetry, those are not abstract concepts. They show up in your postcodes, they show up in your schools, in your access to capital when you try to start a business, in the generational wealth that your family did or did not inherit, in the systems that you're trying to build freedom within. See, understanding the economics of where you came from is not about living in the past. It's about understanding the terrain that you're operating on. A general who doesn't know the battlefield can't develop a strategy, not an effective one anyway. And a community that does not understand its economic history cannot build an effective economic future. This is why economics is life and why life is economics. And here's what gives me genuine hope. Like I said, I was in Ghana the other day on the eve of this resolution, and I'm in Nigeria now, days after it's passed. See, the continent isn't waiting for permission, and a new generation, our generation, is understanding that building wealth, owning assets, claiming our heritage rights, investing in the continent, these are not just personal finance decisions. They're acts of economic self-determination. They are the practical response to everything that this resolution acknowledges. See, our ancestors had their capital taken. Our job is to build it back for ourselves, for our communities, for the generation that comes after us. Freedom was taken, capital was taken. Our work is to build both back deliberately, strategically, and with a full understanding of the history that we're operating within. This week, 123 countries stood up at the United Nations and said what was done to African people was the gravest crime against humanity. The UK abstained. Remember that. United States voted no. Israel voted no. But 123 countries said yes. And that's now on record, permanently. I was in Ghana on the eve of this moment. I'm in Nigeria as it lands. Two countries, one story. The same West African coastline that watched millions of people leave in chains and never come back. I'm filming this because the people who watch this channel deserve more than just headlines. You deserve the economics. You deserve to understand the terrain that you're operating on. Because that understanding of how this gap was engineered, of what has now been formally acknowledged at the highest level, that understanding is capital. Economics is not just numbers. Economics is a story of who has power, of who has resources, and how that came to be. And the transatlantic slave trade is the foundational chapter of that story for every person of African heritage alive today. Knowing that story doesn't make us victims. It makes us informed, and informed people make better decisions, better investments, better choices for their families and their communities. Understanding the past is not about blame. Blame doesn't get you anywhere. It's about positioning. See, freedom is capital, and it was taken from our ancestors, and it's our obligation to build it back. Economics is life, and life is economics. I'll see you in the next one, people. Peace.